What if the greatest temple in history had never been built? Not destroyed, not delayed, but intentionally prevented. Stones separated, plans revealed, promise declared, and then silence. The absence hides something more disturbing than ruins. An ignored truth, a hidden warning, and a project taken from human hands. Nothing here was an accident. Observe carefully. For centuries, the official narrative claimed that the temple was merely awaiting the right moment. But the texts, silences, and decisions point in another direction. Something happened before construction began. An order was given, then withdrawn. A limit was imposed. And the further one delves into the ancient records, the clearer it becomes that the temple was not lost to time, but blocked for a specific reason. The final revelation brings no comfort, only the unsettling feeling that certain structures should never touch the world of men. The idea of a temple has always been central to the faith of Israel. From the desert, the divine presence inhabited tents, portable altars, and temporary spaces. When the people settled down, the desire arose to build something permanent, solid, and visible. David dreamed of this, prepared materials, and imagined a place where God would finally rest. But something strange happened in this process. The project advanced in intention, but not in execution. There was human enthusiasm, but divine resistance. The temple was promised but not immediately permitted, and this interval, often ignored, carried signs that the construction was not merely a matter of time, but of limitation. Something needed to be understood before any stone was laid upon another. In ancient texts, God accepts the idea of the temple but rejects the builder. David is prevented not by a technical failure, but by something deeper. His hands bore blood, wars, decisions too difficult to erect a divine resting place. The justification seems simple, but it hides another layer. If the temple were merely a building, this would not be a problem. However, what was at stake was representation. A fixed space could redefine how the people perceived God, limiting him to walls, routines, and human control. By barring David, something greater was being signaled. The question was not who would build, but whether the construction should even happen in that way. The refusal did not delay the temple. It silently cast doubt on everything. When Solomon takes over, everything finally seems aligned: peace, wealth, alliances, and wisdom. The perfect setting for the construction that David could not accomplish. Yet the texts reveal something unsettling. Even before the work begins, warnings are given. The temple is permitted, but conditionally. Not as a celebration, but as a concession. God makes it clear that his presence would not be confined to the stones, and that the building could become a problem if it were confused with spiritual security. The people wanted a fixed center, something visible to rely on. But the faith that had been shaped in the desert was always mobile, dependent, unstable by nature. The authorization came laden with warnings, as if the construction were tolerated, not desired. And when something divine is merely tolerated, the risk is already inherent from the beginning. As the temple takes shape, a paradox emerges that is difficult to ignore. The grander the structure becomes, the more distant the divine presence seems to recede. Solomon dedicates the building with words that reveal an awareness of this limitation, admitting that not even the heavens could contain God. The temple is born accompanied by a contradiction. It was built to house something that cannot be contained, and this silently changes the relationship between the people and the sacred. What previously demanded obedience and listening is replaced by rituals, sacrifices, and predictability. Faith begins to rely on the place, not on the covenant. At this moment, the temple ceases to be merely a space and becomes a test, not of devotion but of dependence. And when dependence shifts its focus, the consequences begin to accumulate slowly, almost imperceptibly, until they become inevitable. Over time, the temple begins to function as a psychological shield. The people believe that, as long as it exists, nothing can happen. Prophets arise to confront this illusion, affirming that divine presence is not guaranteed by walls or ceremonies. Jeremiah echoes this directly, warning that trusting in the temple as protection is a dangerous deception. But these voices are rejected. The physical structure becomes more convincing than the spiritual warning. The temple, which should remind them of the covenant, begins to replace it. And when a symbol takes the place of commitment, it transforms into a silent idol. At this point, something changes irreversibly. The building that should bring people closer begins to distance them. Not out of malice, but out of comfort. Faith becomes complacent, and the divine warning begins to sound like an unjust threat. It is then that the initial idea returns with force. Perhaps the temple should never have existed as an anchor for the relationship between God and humankind. When destruction finally occurs, it doesn't come as a divine surprise, but as a foretold consequence. The temple falls not because God failed to protect it, but because he never promised to do so in the way the people believed. Yet after the fall, something strange remains. Even with the opportunity to rebuild, the same model doesn't fully return. The second temple emerges reduced, incomplete, without the same symbolic presence. Essential elements are missing, intensity is lacking, something impossible to name is missing. This reinforces a disturbing interpretation. The original construction may have been an outlier, not an eternal pattern. As if the temple had fulfilled a temporary role and, by failing as a center of faith, had lost the right to exist in the same way. The absence teaches more than the structure taught when it stood, and silence returns to occupy the space where stones once stood. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Over the centuries, the absence of the temple began to shape a new spiritual understanding. Without an absolute physical center, faith was forced to spread. Synagogues emerged, texts gained centrality, and individual responsibility grew. The divine presence ceased to be associated with a geographical point and began to inhabit consciousness, obedience, and the Word. This displacement was not accidental. It corrected what the temple had distorted. The people slowly learned that God does not depend on location. Curiously, the more distant the temple became, the more accessible the sacred became. This raises an uncomfortable suspicion. Perhaps the construction served only to reveal the human error of wanting to fix the infinite. When this error is exposed, the structure loses its function, and what is never rebuilt perhaps should never have been repeated. Later texts reinforce this interpretation by pointing to a future without temples, where divine presence would not depend on buildings. Prophecies speak of a time when worship would not be tied to a specific place, but to truth and intention. This change does not appear as a loss but as maturation. The temple, once seen as the pinnacle, begins to seem like an intermediate stage, a temporary resource for a people still learning to trust without visible signs. When this phase ends, insisting on complete reconstruction becomes unnecessary, even counterproductive. Absence then ceases to be a historical flaw and becomes a message, a silent reminder that the sacred cannot be confined or repeated for human convenience. What was not rebuilt teaches more than what was once erected in glory. Nevertheless, the human desire to rebuild has never completely disappeared. Throughout history, movements, expectations, and even political plans have emerged promising to restore the temple, as if this would resolve a spiritual void. But this impulse reveals the same original flaw, the pursuit of control. A temple offers structure, hierarchy, and predictability. It transforms faith into a system. Perhaps that is why its complete reconstruction never progresses beyond intention. There are always obstacles, conflicts, or interruptions, not as historical chance, but as a repetition of a pattern. Each attempt exposes the human difficulty in accepting a relationship with the divine without physical mediation. The temple becomes a symbol of something that man desires, but which spiritual development itself renders obsolete. Rebuilding it would mean regressing. And perhaps the greatest sign that it will never be erected again is the fact that the world has changed too much to fit inside it. There is also a deeper, almost uncomfortable reading that emerges from this permanent void. The idea is that the temple was not merely overcome, but deliberately closed, as if the experience had revealed something too dangerous to be repeated. A fixed place of spiritual authority tends to concentrate power, distort messages, and replace conscience with mechanical obedience. By allowing the temple to disappear without full return, the biblical narrative seems to shift the axis of faith inward to the individual. The sacred ceases to be a destination and becomes a state. This demands maturity, responsibility, and continuous choice, something far more difficult than following rituals in a defined space. The temple, then, does not fail because it is destroyed, but because it fulfills its function to the limit. When that limit is reached, insisting on rebuilding it would be to ignore the central lesson that its absence has silently taught. Without a physical temple, each person is forced to find the divine within themselves and around them. The focus shifts from structure to experience, from stone to consciousness. The sacred ceases to be something external to be observed and becomes something lived, felt, and interpreted. Absence forces spiritual maturity, demanding that faith become practical, active, and conscious, and not merely symbolic or ritualistic. The unbuilt temple serves as a permanent reminder of limits. It warns that the desire to fix the infinite in human forms is dangerous. Every attempt at complete reconstruction, every expectation of security, is confronted by inevitable obstacles. Absence becomes a guiding force. It teaches, corrects, provokes reflection, and prevents faith from being transformed into a system of control or illusory comfort. Ultimately, the absence of the temple leaves a profound and lasting legacy. It shapes spiritual cultures, practices, and mindsets that value responsibility, choice, and freedom. The lack of a physical structure does not diminish faith. On the contrary, it expands its dimension. Perhaps the greatest temple has never been made of stone, but of collective consciousness, an invisible space that transcends generations, sustaining a connection with the divine that cannot be confined, repeated, or controlled. If you enjoyed this approach and want to continue exploring stories that are almost never told this way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, click on the video that's appearing on the screen. It directly complements what you just watched and may completely change the way you see this story.